All right, so to get started adding authentication to our app, which we're doing with Firebase Auth, the first thing we're going to do is set up a basic login page and create account page for our front end. Now, we've been through this several times before, so I'm not going to go into too much depth about what we're doing here. But one thing we are going to be doing a little bit differently than we might have done before is instead of just creating a login page and create account page directly inside the pages folder and just writing all of the input elements, button elements, etc. inside those pages, we're going to create a separate component for those two things. And what this is going to allow us to do is once we add some more advanced functionality to our application, users are going to be able to log into our app not just through a page, but through things like modals or drop-downs or pop-ups or lots of other elements that basically users will be able to log in through instead of having to go to a completely separate page. Now, for the time being, we are going to have them log in through a login and create account page, but we're going to actually create separate login and create account forms in our components folder that will just be displaying on those pages. So here's what all of that's going to look like. We're going to start off here by creating a new component called loginform.js, and we'll create another one called createaccountform.js. And I'm going to go through implementing these two components, but what I'm not going to go through is actually adding all of the styling. That's something I'm just going to be copying and pasting from a previous project, right? Like the one where we saw how to use Firebase Auth for the first time, or when we added that to our friend tracker application. So if you followed those things, congratulations, you can just copy and paste those. If not, there's a GitHub repo that you should be able to copy and paste the code from. So anyway, let's get started implementing these two components. We're going to start off with the login form, since this will be the simplest, and then I'll just open up the create account form later. So to get started with this, we're going to need to import a few things. The first thing, since we're going to be creating a form here, is going to be our use state hook, which we're going to import from React. Okay, and additionally, we're also going to import the link component from our React Router DOM package. And that should be it for now. We are going to have to import something related to Firebase later on, but for now, let's just create this component. Okay, so we're going to say export const login form here. And this component's actually going to take some props. Now, we'll actually add those props when we get there, but basically what these props are going to allow us to do is add somewhat different functionality depending on where we're actually displaying this login form, right? So if we were to display this login form, say, inside a modal, right, on a larger page like this with a, the typical modal background here, if we were to display this login form in a modal, we'd want it to behave slightly differently than if we were to just display it on a page, right? If we were to just display it on its own page, then what we'll want to happen when the user actually logs in, if they're successful, is we'll want to actually navigate them to a different page. Now, with a modal, we're going to want to do more than that. We're going to want to, first of all, close the modal, right? And then we're going to want to probably navigate them to a different page, or maybe not, right? That's what these props here are going to allow us to decide later on. So essentially what we're doing here is we're pushing off those decisions into the future once we actually decide where this form is going to be displayed. So I'm just going to leave those props blank for now, which we're allowed to do in React. And we're going to start off here by setting up the email and password inputs. So of course we're going to need some separate state variables for both of those. We're going to need an email and password state variable. So we'll say email set email equals use state empty string and const password set password equals use state. That's going to be an empty string as well. You're almost certainly familiar with this by this point. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define the JSX for this component. So this component, in order to allow the parent component to define how it's displayed, right, how wide it is, what kind of container it's inside of, all of our elements here are just going to be inside of React fragments. Okay, that will allow the parent component to define the container for it, as we've seen. And inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to display an input element. So we'll say input. And the placeholder here is just going to be a fake email. We'll say johndoe@gmail.com. Under that, we're going to have value equals our email state variable. And to create a binding in the other direction, we're going to say onChange. And we're going to set email to e.target.value. That's nothing new there. We've already seen how that works. So the next input that we're going to define is going to be our password input. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say input. And the placeholder here is going to be your password. And then value is going to be password, of course. And the onChange is going to be, there we go, onChange equals set password to e.target.value. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to have a button here. And what that's going to look like, we're going to say onClick equals, and here's where we're going to start adding props to our login form. We're going to add a prop here called onSubmitLogin. And basically, that's just going to be a function that gets called when the user tries to log in, right? That's where we can actually allow the parent component to define what happens when the user tries to log in, right? Do we navigate to a different page immediately? Do we hide a modal? Do we dismiss a pop-up? Do we change some other element on the page, right? That's what we're going to allow the parent component to do. So for onClick, we're just going to say on, well, this is going to be an anonymous function here. We're going to say onSubmitLogin, and we're going to pass the email and password to this function as arguments. And that will even allow the parent component to be the one that decides what tool to use to log the user in. Okay, now if we wanted to, and this is maybe something that we'll look at later, if we wanted to, we could include the logic inside of here for logging a user in via Firebase. And what we could do in that case is we could actually change this prop to something like on logged in successful. And basically what we would do in that case is we would only call this prop if the user successfully logged in. Now what this would allow us to do is actually take care of any errors that occur inside the form itself, as well as avoid duplicating any kind of login logic, right? Like Firebase auth logic. And as I describe it, that's actually sounding pretty good, but for now, what we're going to do is just go back to what we had before. We're going to use onSubmitLogin, and we're going to allow the parent component to decide for the time being. Again, maybe we'll change that later. Honestly, it's sounding pretty good the more I describe it. So, anyway, now that we have this button is just going to say log in. And additionally, there are actually two things that you might have noticed that are missing from this component. The first one is a heading, right? Aren't we supposed to have some kind of heading that says log in up at the top of this form? Well, yes and no, right? This is something that we're also going to leave up to the parent component to decide. So if the parent component wants to have a giant login heading up at the top of the form, all it will have to do is say, h1 and display login inside of those tags, and then it will just be able to display the login form underneath it, right? There's really no reason why we have to include this login heading inside the login form itself. Now the same is true here for this link that we used to have down at the bottom of our login form that would send us to the create account page, right? A little link component basically that would say, don't have an account, blah, blah, blah. Create one here, right? And basically you would click on this link and that would take you to the create account page. That's how it worked when we actually had specific login and create account pages. In this case, we don't know that that's going to be the exact situation. So just like we're doing up here with the login heading, we're going to allow the parent component to be the one that displays this link if that's what we want, right? That actually wouldn't make any sense at all if we were displaying our login form inside a modal, because if we wanted the user to log in inside a modal, we wouldn't actually want to navigate when they click on this link. We would want to use some kind of state variable probably to display the create account form inside that modal instead of the login form, right? So that's why we're not including this thing in this form either. Basically what the parent component is going to be able to do, if that's what they want, is say link to equals blah, 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 and then say whatever text they want here inside those tags. So the parent component is going to be the one that determines all of this stuff, is the point that I'm trying to make. Now, I will admit that as I've been talking, I realized that I imported this link thing out of habit, not really thinking ahead to what I just said about this thing. So we're actually going to delete that link because we're not going to need it, right? We're going to use that inside the actual login page or login modal or login pop-up or login. You get the idea. So that's our login form. And that's pretty much all we need to do at this point for that. So let's go and create our create account form, which is going to use similar concepts to those that we just covered for our login form. All right, so here's what this one's going to look like. We're going to start off, of course, by importing use state, since obviously we'll be creating a form inside here, as the name would suggest. And then we're going to say from React. Under that, we're going to well, I was going to say we're going to import link, but I just realized again that that wouldn't be correct either, just like it wasn't correct in the login form. So what we're going to do next is we're going to say export const create account form. And this one too is going to take some props, which we'll define in just a minute once we get there in the JSX. First of all, though, we're going to define some state variables. The first one here will be their email. All right, so email set email equals use state. Initial value of that's going to be an empty string. And under that, we're going to have const password and set password equal to use state empty string. And then we'll have the confirm password. So we'll say confirm password, set confirm password equals use state. And that's pretty much all we're going to have to do right now, right? If we want to allow the user later on to add their name, right, their first name and last name, that's when we would come back and actually add new state variables like first name, last name, etc. But for now, we know that the user is going to want to log in with their email and password and confirm password, so that's all we're going to have for the time being. All right, so now that we have those state variables set up, the next thing that we're going to do is actually define the JSX for our component. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say return. And just like with our login form, we're going to allow the parent component to decide what the container of this form is going to be by basically displaying all of our elements inside of React fragments. And the first thing here we're going to have is the input. So this will be for the email, and in fact, we can just copy that from the login form. There's no reason to waste valuable typing time. We're going to just put that right in here and delete what I was just typing. And after that, we're going to have the password, which, again, we can just copy and paste this. Oh, before we do that, actually, we need to set type equals password so that someone can't just look over the user's shoulder and see what their password is. All right, so after adding that, let's copy and paste this into the create account form. And there we have it. Now, you might be wondering by what I just did, right? Copying and pasting the email and password inputs, you might be wondering if there's a way to, decrease this code reuse, right? To eliminate the code that we're copying and pasting. And that's where the question of code reuse versus, just making components that make sense comes in. Because what I see people do a lot of the time in order to reduce the amount of repeated code, basically, since people have heard so many times the principle, do not repeat yourself, right? That's the dry principle of software development. Since they've heard that so many times, they come to believe that any kind of repeated code is evil. Now, don't get me wrong. In general, I like to avoid repeated code if it makes sense. But in our case here, if we wanted to encapsulate these elements that we just copied and pasted from the login form in their own component, that would be something like, the component would come to be called something like name and password form. And then what we would do is inside our login form and create account form, we would actually use that component, say name and password form, and we would have to have some kind of props to get the name and password values from that, and ultimately would just end up not making any sense. So this is one of those cases where repeating code isn't necessarily a sign that we're doing something wrong. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. Now, one thing you could do, if you really wanted to avoid repeated code while still making things make sense, is you could replace things like the placeholder for our email and password inputs with some kind of text, right? This is where things like localization come in, where if you needed to swap this code out the way we currently have it set up, you would need to actually go back into our create account form and our login form and remove this. And, if you wanted to do johndoe@gmail.com in some other language, right? I don't know if there's an equivalent of John Doe in other languages, but whatever it is, you could actually have that filled in automatically by some kind of localization engine, right? So I'm not going to go into that right now, but essentially the idea there is that you would have a package where you could just call or internationalization. I've been saying localization. Internationalization is what I'm thinking, where you could just say internationalization library, whatever it's called, right? I'm just going to call it international. And then you could say dot get placeholder email text or something like that, and that would take care of filling that in for you, right? So that would be one way to sort of reduce the amount of repeated code so that you wouldn't have to make that same change in multiple places if that's what you really wanted to do. But since I'm just kind of rambling at this point, let's get back to creating our create account form. And what we're going to need to do next is add a confirm password input. So let's copy this input here. We're going to put that down underneath, and we're going to change this now to placeholder. We'll say re-enter your password. There we go. And for value, we'll say confirm password. And we'll say set confirm password here to make sure that we're setting the correct state variable. And that should be all for our create account forms inputs. So underneath this, we just need to put a button, which when it's clicked, we'll call the prop for our create account form, which is going to be very similar to what we did in our login form. What we're going to do is say on submit create account. Or you know what? Let's just say on submit. In fact, I'm going to change that on login form as well. We're going to say on submit, and we'll have on submit for create account form as well, just to avoid long props names where they're not really necessary. We know it's a form. We know it's going to be submitted. We know basically what properties it's going to contain. So we'll just call it on submit. All right, and our button here, when it's clicked, is going to call that on submit with the current values of email, password, and confirm password, and we're going to allow the parent component to take care of all of that logic for us. Okay, so we'll say on click. We're going to say on submit inside an anonymous function here, and the arguments that we'll pass will be email, password, and confirm password. All right, and this is just going to say create account. And that should be all we need for this. Again, what we're doing here is we're avoiding showing the heading up at the top that would say something in, all caps probably, like create account, because that's not necessarily what we want. And even in the situation where it is what we want, we can just have the parent component be the one that displays this instead of our create account form. Okay, and likewise, the link down here that would link the user back to the login page is just going to be displayed by the parent component as well, using probably a link component of some kind. So that's the basic plan there, and those are our login forms and create account forms. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.